there was a lot of things that came together between Donald Trump's win and Hillary Clinton's loss. And, one dynamic that just strikes me is that I don't know if you read that book of The Persistence of the Color Line by Randall Terry, and
I haven't read it yet.
His argument, it was many years ago, or 4 or 5 years ago.
Yeah.
And he argued that, Barack Obama could not talk about race and could not engage in race, and could not show anger because it would have destroyed everything. And certainly Hillary Clinton, like anger at a time where there's an anger in the country, she's not allowed to access it because of the way that anger is perceived by women. So basically one arrow that would have been there for any politician who was not a woman, that's taken out of the quiver at that point, right?
That is exactly right. That is exactly right. And she was running against two men on both her left and her right who were able to access anger, and they both used it quite masterfully, right? And my politics are on the side of one of those guys, was, Bernie Sanders, speaking with righteous fury about economic inequality and the 99% and that he was able to channel the rage of millions of his supporters who were feeling, in my view, had every reason in the world to be livid, and he was able to be a voice of that and wag his finger and shake his head and pound a podium. And Donald Trump, whose politics are anathema to me, he was able to challenge a rage coming from a sort of a base that was furious about the perceived incursions on its status and its power, and he was able to channel a fundamentally racist, xenophobic, misogynistic fury through truly, in many cases, direct calls to violence. I mean, in the old days, we used to take protesters out and, he was able to actually give voice to a punitive, not just borderline, but sometimes directly violent rage that had racist and sexist implications to talk about, those fears that have obviously worked for his base. And Clinton, when she tried to be angry, first of all, this is a woman who is raised, also born in an era in which this was completely verboten, the raising of the female voice, had actually been a young adult at the moment of the second wave women's movement. But she had already, she had been raised in a country that had no tolerance, made no space for the fury of, especially of powerful women who were threatening male power in any way. It is inauthentic when she tries to, transmit rage. She would sometimes thunder into a microphone, and what would everybody, by the way, including me, do is rear back and say, stop yelling, because we're not used to hearing that.
Well, even going back to 92 when she said, I'm not going to be baking cookies in the kitchen or something. And I was no fan of Bill Clinton at that time either. But the reaction to that was just, that dynamic, is like, reminds me of like when Steven Spielberg did his first movie and it was a bust. And then he decided, I'm only making huge hits from now on that are less nuanced. I felt like that was her moment where she was like, all right, now I've got to change my hairdo and et cetera, et cetera. But so
I think the one that came before that was when she was blamed for her husband losing re-election in Arkansas because she kept her own maiden name. Where it was like, what are you going to, that was 1980. And after he lost his re-election bid in Arkansas, the press said it was because his wife wouldn't take his name. And that's when that for me was like the first moment in like the transformation into Darth Vader, is like the moment that like she writes about it with actually incredible candor in various places about that moment where she realized she had to become Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Okay, so we take that forward. She's learned those lessons because those are lessons society. But it not only takes that arrow out of her quiver, it forces her at that point to use an arrow maybe that she doesn't want to use, right? Which is like maybe being too optimistic in some respects. But if you can't differentiate one way because it's not available to you, part of the problem is it forces you to avail yourself of another option that is suboptimal. But leaving that aside, so going from there, let's talk about the Me Too thing, because it seems to me that Me Too was it was a sort of a surrogate for Donald Trump. Like the country did not hold this guy accountable for the obvious, like, because the difficulty is always like it's a he said, she said type of situation. And, we can't know what happens when two people shut the door or why, but in this instance, it was clear to everybody, right? There's like literally like tape. And it was the message to women that, like, even when we don't have these evidentiary questions, even when we all know what the truth is, still not going to hold them accountable. It feels like Me Too came out of, like, we couldn't get Donald Trump, but we can get other people. And I don't mean to be saying this like it was it was about time, but it was like there's an overdue debt of justice here, and we're going to go for that on some level. And what's your sense of that?
Well, yes and no. I think I agree. I think that I agree with you that, for example, I don't think the fall of 2017 #MeToo movement, I don't think that it would have had the staying power or exploded in the way that it did had Donald Trump not been president.
Right.
On the other hand, I'm not sure which is the symptom and which is right. I think Donald Trump himself, it's like, think of the number of men who, in fact, wound up facing repercussion during the 2017 #MeToo movement. And we should say that, of course, the Me Too movement was founded by Tarana Burke in 2006, specifically to address sexual violence in communities of color. And the #MeToo movement that was popularized in the fall of 2017 is an outgrowth of that movement, and it's a broader umbrella term to cover harassment and in a wide range of things. But I think that so many of the men, it wasn't just Donald Trump. Consider that Bill O'Reilly, like stories about Bill O'Reilly, I mean, he was sued. I wrote about a lawsuit against him for sexual harassment when I was a young journalist, probably in 2004.
Macris,
and yet he had
right?
Andrea Macris. And yet he kept his berth on television, a bajillion-dollar berth on television for all the intervening years. Consider Arnold Schwarzenegger. Stories about his groping had been on the record, and women had gone on the record with their names and talked about how he groped them, and he nonetheless got elected governor. Consider Roger Ailes. Stories about him had been published in Gabriel Sherman's book about him, and they had been poo-pooed by the New York Times, claimed, and nobody paid attention. He'd kept his, not only Bill O'Reilly and Roger Ailes, of course, not only kept their jobs and made millions of dollars, they also had the opportunity, given their berths to their media berths and their platforms and the power that platform that they built had, to basically contribute to the election of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Fox News created this president. They had so much power, in addition to the wealth that they were garnering. They had so much power to control the political conversation, and this despite having been credibly and on the record accused of acts of harassment and assault. Then you had Donald Trump. Oh, and Bill Cosby. There were many stories, public stories with names, Andrea Constand's name attached to stories about Bill Cosby. And for more than a decade, for 12 years or something, he had continued to win Lifetime Achievement Awards, get new television deals, be hailed as a hero in some communities. So this is a buildup of, it's not just about Donald Trump. Trump was, in combination with the political fury, in combination with the surprise that many people felt at this understanding that Hillary Clinton, this qualified woman, had just been passed over for this job, for this raging racist toddler. The fact is that there had been an explosion of rage in the wake of the Access Hollywood tape, and that it had not prevented him from becoming the president, was like, it was like a final straw, but it wasn't all about him, right? This is a pattern. This is the point, is that these men could be credibly accused by people, and it just didn't impede their rise to power or their further accrual of power. And it was like there was an anger that was so intense that when that story came out about Harvey Weinstein, it was like, we are not going to let this pass by. It was like a desire to hang on until these guys face repercussion. And I've never seen anything like that before. I've never lived through anything like that before. But it was like the fury. I don't think it was Sure, imaginatively, it might have been a stand-in for Donald Trump, but it was also for its own purposes.
Right.
Like, no, we are not going to be chased out of telling these stories.
Trump was the sort of the final symptom in some ways that basically said, like, this is undeniable now, and we're going to treat it on some level. The other thing that occurs to me happened during that time, or at least, I think we've seen it both sort of publicly and certainly in the context of privately, women I know have reassessed like their realities in some way, their histories, and now realize that there were relationships that they had, work relationships, whatever, non-work relationships where they were sexually harassed. They were in some fashion either suppressed or assaulted. That they
or that they've been complicit in it in somebody else's case. I mean, the whole reevaluation of once we get to the point, because if you live in a world in which all these guys and all the guys I just mentioned, right, and are getting elected president and governor and running TV networks and being hailed as heroes, and and you absorb the reality, which is that your experience of having been, assaulted by them or harassed by them or belittled or diminished or treated poorly by them just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Nobody cares. And you really absorb that. And so when you have a Me Too movement, you have something like, as has happened over the past year, where there's an acknowledgement of the damage that this behavior has wrought. It's like you finally can open up that door in your own brain and your own memory, and all the stuff that you stuffed in there because what was going to happen, what was going to come of really thinking about it. There was so much evidence all around us that no one cared. It didn't matter. And then when you get a sort of invitation to
and that even it wasn't
it,
wrong,
it all pours out.
It wasn't even, I was like, it was like an assessment of nothing wrong happened. Like, it's not even like there's something wrong that happened and no one's going to care. It was like that's just normal. Right.
That's just life. That's just normal. Yes.
So where if in the wake of Donald Trump, this anger, there was this sort of, not necessarily explosion of anger, but I guess this eruption of existing anger and assessment that we should be angry, and a different expression of it. I mean, tell me, like, do you think that there has been a lasting change, in the ability, and to what extent has there been a change in the ability of women to be angry in, relative to men, let's say, where, a men's anger is, it's just, you mentioned Pat Schroeder. If I remember correctly, the thing that really knocked her out of the race was that she cried. Like, there was a moment where
she was announcing, when she cried, she was announcing that she wasn't going to run.
Okay.
So I don't know if it's quite right to say that that's what knocked her out, but that was the thing for which she became famous.
Yes, it was like the idea that she would cry in public. And then I feel like we've seen many examples of men cry in public, and it's like...
John Boehner never stopped crying.
Exactly. He was just... Yeah. And it's impressive. It's impressive. He was able to do that. It took a lot of guts to cry in public for that guy.
Yeah.
And... has the ability for women to be angry, because, frankly, like, I'm thinking about Elizabeth Warren. I'm from Massachusetts. I'm a big fan of hers. When I talk to people in Massachusetts who I think should also be big fans of hers, like, I almost get a unilateral, I should say unanimous response. And I feel like it's a gendered response to when she gets angry. Like, she's a scold. And it's like, what?
Right. So the question of, are we making material change? I do think that we are making I think we are in the midst of changing our perceptions about how women can express themselves and be taken seriously. But we make a mistake, again, when we imagine that we can fix it quickly. This is hundreds of years, generation upon generation upon generation of conditioning, of social messaging around what's appropriate, around what tones are effective. This is, again, we talk about change in this country as if it's something that we can be quickly proud of having fixed. But in fact, when you're talking about a nation that was baked into its initial promises of equality and liberty, were structurally enforced inequality and inhumanity, you are talking about problems that take so long to fix, and that we have to be in the midst of probably inevitably for the rest of our lives. So I do think that there are changes that are being made around how I think if you look at the way that some of these new young women are moving into Congress, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, the voices that they're using and the unwillingness to be sort of solicitous and polite, I think you're seeing that's a data point in terms of we're changing the register in which we can hear and respect and acknowledge as consequential certain kinds of women's voices. That's a huge set of changes we're seeing being wrought around that. I think that the fact that we're having conversations about how Hillary Clinton was heard, how Elizabeth Warren is heard, how Kamala Harris as an African American woman is heard when she challenges Jeff Sessions or raises her voice as a prosecutor on a Senate Judiciary Committee. And the ways that she gets characterized as hysterical or punitive or worrying in some way. Like the fact that we're having these conversations is helping to change how we hear these women, but it's not something where we're ever in our lifetimes that right. You or I is ever going to be able to say like, well, now we love angry women. Like it's not going to be that quick. It's a long, arduous, complicated, multifaceted process. And the thing I want this book to do more than anything, and people often understand it to be like a call to raise your voice in anger, and it's not that actually, because there's so many ways in which women are punished in one way or another for offering loud challenge, right? So I would never encourage, if you're a woman of color who's pulled over by a cop for no reason, you have right. every reason in the world to be livid, but if you voice that fury, you risk your life, if you're a woman who is paid unequally in her office, you have every reason to be furious, but if you raise your voice about it in your office, you're going to get a reputation perhaps as difficult, or you're not going to get that raise, or you're going to get fired. There are real costs to that. So my book is not trying to encourage people to speak differently. It's to listen differently. It's to listen for these patterns. It's to listen to the patterns in our own head that write off women whose voices are raised in angry or disruptive dissent as, complicated or hysterical or too much. Start listening to anger of marginalized people, including women, as instructive and diagnostic, as politically and socially potent. I want us to listen differently, to receive women's anger differently, and to watch for the patterns in which it is discounted and dismissed, and in our own heads and more broadly, and so that's part of the work of changing things, but that is going to be the work of our lifetime.
It's a long-term project to get people to listen differently, to hear it differently and whatnot. The other thing that has, I think, obviously come in the wake of this is that, and Thedescopel and Lena Putnam, I think it was, and even, the Intercept stories about what was happening on the ground showed, I think were indicative of a rising activism, and I think you mentioned, of women who had otherwise been maybe a reliable Democratic vote, maybe midterms, but now are running for office, are at the forefront of activist groups in terms of, particularly in the context of elections. I think just like stumbled into multiple, essentially, groups of women who were organizing to send money to a state race in Colorado across the city. That energy you don't need. Is that what's your feeling about that engagement, that level of energy, where that's going to be within 5 or 10 years? I mean, if the listening and getting society obviously to change their knee-jerk reactions to women's anger is a long-term project. What about that involvement? I mean, have there been like a generation or two of women whose political engagement is forever implicated?
Well, I hope so. This is an open question, and it depends. This is why I get anxious when I hear this all just tied to Trump, because in part, I certainly hope that Trump is going to be gone soon, and in 2 years, or even if it's in 6 years. God, I hope not.
Right.
It's not, that's why I get anxious whenever somebody ties this directly to being about Donald Trump, because Donald Trump in this regard is absolutely symptomatic. He is the thing that has made the project of the American right wing evident, because he just says all the quiet parts loud. But if we attach it too much to Trump, then there'll be this myth, again, that pernicious but seductive myth that we fixed it. Oh, we got rid of Trump, it's done. But in fact, we know that it's not done, that his presidency was enabled by a party and by a set of ideologies and attitudes about who deserves to have power and who is permitted to participate equally and receive equal rights and equal protections in this country. That is, again, anger of a lifetime. Now, the question is, how many of those newly angry people will stay angry for the rest of their lifetimes? And that is up to those people, and including us. And I think that one of the big opportunities of this moment is, even if people are coming to the anger specifically, say, about Trump, I hope that part of what we're doing is having a conversation and in a period where people are really getting an education about all of the inequalities that are out there that require steady anger and vigilance and fight and commitment to being civic participants and political combatants, right? I think that the opportunity here is an education, and that's within progressive coalitions too, about the racism, the sexism, the inequality that exists within progressive coalitions. A lot of the conversations happening within a women's movement, this iteration of a women's movement, are about racism within that women's movement, and that's especially true for a lot of the suburban middle-class white women who are new to the anger. A lot of them are also learning about anger at them, because of the unequal amount of space they've taken up within progressive and feminist coalitions, while women of color, who often have been doing the groundbreaking intellectual and political work and have been the base of the Democratic Party for years, go underrepresented and their needs acknowledged and within that Democratic Party and any kind of left coalition. Those kinds of conversations, I hope, which are also rooted in anger that happens within a progressive coalition, I hope are going to reshape us so that the acknowledgement of the problems we have to solve go way beyond Trump. And I hope that it extends deep into our future. But we won't know until we get there. And this is a question. There will always be incentives for women, and particularly for white women who are adjacent to white, especially middle-class white men. There will always be incentives in place for them to quell their anger and to go back to being non-disruptors. And that is something that we have to be very attentive to, because there will be those messages that are put on offer.
Rebecca Traister, the book is Good and Mad, The Revolutionary Power of Women's Anger. Thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Sam.